Welcome back, everyone, to Diplomacy and International Relations. Whether you are, joining us on your commute or studying up on global affairs, we are so thrilled to have you with us for this deep dive.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
So on this broadcast, we usually focus on international relations, global politics, and of course, our regular updates on Danish political developments. And usually when we look at international relations, it feels like like a hardware issue, right?
Yeah, exactly. Tangible things.
Right, you look at the global stage and you count the assets. You
Yeah.
measure trade deficits, map out borders, count barrels of oil, military installations, all that.
Which makes sense. I mean, we are conditioned by a post-Enlightenment world to expect secular rationality.
Right. The assumption is that states operate kind of like corporations. They want security, they want wealth, and they negotiate based on, earthly material realities.
Right, the traditional chessboard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you, our listeners, reached out to us recently and asked us to look into a stack of reports detailing a very different kind of global shift.
A really fascinating shift, yeah.
You wanted to know what happens when states start rewriting the fundamental operating system of diplomacy. Like what happens when they update the software to run on theology?
And the short answer is it completely changes how the hardware behaves.
Oh, totally.
I mean, when a state introduces the sacred into its statecraft, that rational calculus of traditional diplomacy it breaks down.
Because the stakes are higher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are no longer negotiating over a strip of land with a price tag attached. You're negotiating over a promised land with a divine mandate attached.
Wow. Yeah, so a rival army isn't just a competitor for resources anymore.
No, they become an instrument of metaphysical evil. And it's a paradigm shift that makes the standard tools of conflict resolution, compromise, treaties, financial incentive, suddenly feel obsolete.
Right. And that is exactly what we built this deep dive for today.
Yeah.
To synthesize this massive shift for you, which analysts are calling the new geopolitics of faith, or sacred statecraft.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We're going to look at how global powers are increasingly weaving religion directly into their foreign policy. Basically moving away from secular diplomacy and utilizing theology as both a shield and a weapon.
But before we open these files, I think we need to do a little housekeeping, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Good catch. Please, if you enjoy our analysis, follow and subscribe to the broadcast. And you can also support the show on Patreon.
Which is where you get all the bonus content.
Exactly. Patreon is where we do our weekly and monthly briefings, specifically on Danish politics. So check the link in the description for that.
Highly recommend it.
Now, second piece of housekeeping, and this is crucial. I need to issue a clear, strict, and impartial disclaimer.
Right, because this material is intense.
Very. The sources provided for today's analysis contain highly politically charged content. We're going to be discussing the policies and rhetoric of the United States, Russia, Israel, Iran, and Nigeria.
A real geopolitical minefield.
Exactly. So I want to state explicitly that neither of us takes any side, left-wing or right-wing, in these conflicts. The goal of this deep dive is strictly to impartially report and analyze the ideas, policies, and frameworks contained in the source material.
We are definitely not endorsing the viewpoints, the theology, or the actions of any political figures or state actors mentioned today.
No, not at all. We are just here as mechanics, looking under the hood at how these diplomatic engines are built.
And the focus really has to remain on those mechanics because the implications are global.
Right. So here's our roadmap. We need to answer a couple of core questions based on the sources you sent us.
First, how does religious soft power function fundamentally differently from hard power in foreign policy?
And second, when we analyze the horrific violence in Nigeria, is that a foreign policy issue, a human rights issue, or a religious issue? And honestly, who gets to decide?
Let's start with that first question, looking at the mechanics of religious soft power.
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
If theology is the new software, we need to see what it looks like when a state codes it from the ground up to build like an invisible shield around its borders.
And for that, we're looking at the Kingdom of Morocco.
Right.
According to an Institute for Strategic Dialogue report in our stack, Morocco has constructed a uniquely symbiotic relationship between the state and the mosque.
Yeah, Morocco really provides a masterclass in institutionalized sacred statecraft.
Because usually there's tension there, right?
Exactly. In a lot of Muslim-majority nations, you see this persistent tension between the political leadership and the religious scholarly class.
Yeah.
The politicians handle the state, the clerics handle the soul, and they clash a lot.
But Morocco just bypasses that entirely.
They eliminate the friction by fusing them at the very top.
Right.
So the King of Morocco does not just hold the secular title of head of state.
Right.
He is constitutionally recognized as the Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful.
And he claims direct lineage to the Prophet Muhammad, which, isn't just ceremonial pomp. That is a massive structural defense mechanism.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. If a radical anti-state cleric stands up in a mosque in Casablanca and tries to incite a rebellion, he isn't just challenging a politician in a suit.
He's theologically challenging the descendant of the Prophet.
Exactly. It short-circuits the core argument of extremist groups. They usually claim the secular state is illegitimate and un-Islamic.
But the Moroccan state preempts that by positioning itself as the ultimate arbiter of Islamic legitimacy.
Right. The state has effectively monopolized the religious framing,
Yeah.
and they do this through a very specific theological architecture. It's often referred to as the Moroccan Islam framework.
And the sources break this down into 3 distinct pillars, right?
Yes. The first is Maliki jurisprudence.
Because Islamic law isn't just a monolith, obviously.
No, not at all. There are different schools of thought. And the Maliki school is highly notable because it places a massive emphasis on local customs, known as urf and community consensus.
Okay, so instead of a rigid literalist reading of a text that just ignores the reality of modern life, the Maliki framework allows for some flexibility.
Exactly. Ahmed Abadi, the Secretary General of the Rabita Mohammedia of Ulema.
That's the state's key religious council, right?
Right. He explains that this jurisprudence evolves with places, times, conditions, and norms.
Which is incredibly smart from a governance perspective. It gives the state the intellectual scaffolding to make modern policy adjustments without being accused of, abandoning the faith.
Precisely. Then you pair that with the second pillar, which is Ash'ari theology.
What does that entail?
It's a philosophical approach that balances revelation with rationalism. So it encourages metaphorical interpretations of Scripture when a literal reading would contradict reason.
Oh, so it acts as an intellectual firewall against the really literalist, fundamentalist interpretations favored by Salafi jihadist groups.
You hit the nail on the head. And then the third pillar is the one that really connects with the grassroots level, which is Sufism.
Right, the mysticism aspect.
Yeah. It introduces spiritual mysticism, focusing on inner transformation, chanting, and a deeply personal connection to the divine.
Which appeals to the popular religiosity that has existed in North and West Africa for centuries.
Exactly. When you combine these 3 adaptable Maliki law, rationalist Ash'ari philosophy, and deeply spiritual Sufism, you create a religious identity that is incredibly durable.
It feels authentic to the local population, but it is entirely aligned with the state's desire for stability and hierarchy.
But, the state didn't just wake up one day and decide to heavily formalize this framework out of purely philosophical interest.
No, there was a brutal catalyst for this. The sources point to the 2003 Casablanca terrorist attack.
Yeah, horrific event.
5 synchronized suicide bombings carried out by local extremists. They targeted restaurants, a hotel, and a Jewish community center. 44 people died.
And this was a massive shock to the Moroccan establishment. It revealed that radical Salafism had taken root right under their noses, operating in slums and unregulated mosques.
Right. Leaving the religious sphere unmanaged was suddenly an existential threat to the state.
So what's the traditional response to terrorism? It's kinetic hard power. You send in the military, increase surveillance, launch night raids, arrest suspects.
And Morocco certainly did utilize security measures.
They did, but they recognized that hard power is entirely reactive. It only deals with the symptom. The underlying disease was ideological.
Right. The extremists were providing a compelling, albeit radical, narrative of what it meant to be a good Muslim.
So the state realized it had to offer a better, more coherent narrative, and this is where we really see the transition into religious soft power.
Instead of just swinging a hammer, Morocco started manipulating the environment, trying to eliminate the ideological oxygen that groups like al-Qaeda rely on.
And they did this through a program that was genuinely revolutionary for traditional Islamic institutional structures.
The Murshidat program.
Yes, the deployment of female religious guides.
This part of the report fascinated me, because following the Casablanca attacks, the state realized it had a massive blind spot, didn't it?
A huge one. The radicalization process wasn't just happening in public mosques. It was happening in private homes, in living rooms, in conversations between mothers and children.
And traditional male imams have very restricted access to those private domestic spheres in a deeply conservative society.
Exactly. So by creating the Murshidat program, the state gained entry to those exact spaces.
And the numbers here show the scale of the ambition. The ISD report notes there were around 1,200 Murshidat active by 2022.
And the state is targeting 2,000 by 2030.
Wow, so these women, they undergo rigorous training in that Maliki Ash'ari Sufi framework, and then they are embedded directly into the community.
Right. They work in mosques, obviously, but also in prisons, schools, orphanages, and civic associations.
They basically function as embedded operators in a prevention-oriented ecology.
That's a great way to put it. A female guide can sit down with a mother in a marginalized neighborhood, provide counseling on intimate family issues, and build trust.
And through that relationship, she can identify if a teenager in that household is, say, consuming radical content online.
Exactly. She provides a counter-narrative grounded in state-sanctioned theology before that teenager ever reaches the point of violence.
It is an incredibly sophisticated, gendered approach to grassroots intelligence and ideological prevention.
It really is. And the success of this domestic program led Morocco to a major geopolitical realization.
That this stabilizing brand of Islam is highly exportable.
Yes, they built the Mohammed VI Foundation for African Ulema and started signing bilateral agreements with countries like Mali, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire.
So Morocco essentially became the theological university for sub-Saharan Africa, bringing in hundreds of foreign imams, training them in Rabat, and sending them back to their home countries.
This is the genius of sacred statecraft. A country like Mali is desperately fighting jihadist insurgencies. Morocco steps in and says, we won't just send you guns, we will send you the theological software to inoculate your population against the insurgency's propaganda. And by doing this, Morocco establishes itself as the indispensable spiritual and security partner for the entire region. They build transnational networks of religious leaders who look to Rabat, and specifically to the king, for guidance.
And the geopolitical payoff for Morocco is immense, specifically regarding their most pressing foreign policy issue, the Western Sahara.
Right.
For our listeners who might not know, this is a massive territory south of Morocco, claimed by both the Moroccan state and the separatist Polisario Front.
So, by exporting religious stability, Morocco accumulates massive diplomatic capital with these African nations.
Yeah, so when it comes time to vote at the UN or the African Union regarding the sovereignty of the Western Sahara, these sub-Saharan states overwhelmingly back Morocco.
Exactly. They isolate the Polisario Front not through military superiority, but through theological diplomacy. You provide the spiritual framework to secure a neighbor's domestic peace, and in exchange, they validate your territorial borders.
It is a brilliant, non-kinetic application of power.
Absolutely.
Wait, I have to interrupt this because it sounds almost too clean.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Like, if I am a Gen Z kid living in Casablanca or a young university student in Mali, and I see the king's appointed councils tightly controlling the curriculum, deciding what is and isn't a sin, and deploying state-trained guides, doesn't that automatically feel inauthentic?
It's a huge risk.
Right. Human nature dictates that youth rebel against state-sponsored mandates. Doesn't this heavy-handed state control risk eroding the actual moral authority of the religion?
The sources acknowledge that exact vulnerability. Scholars analyzing this model, like Mimnat, warn that if religious diplomacy is perceived merely as a mechanism of authoritarian control, if the Murshidat are viewed as state spies rather than spiritual counselors, the entire edifice collapses.
The moral authority just evaporates.
Exactly. Morocco has to constantly walk a tightrope, ensuring the theology feels organically rooted in the culture while serving the state's security apparatus.
And the ISD report highlights an even bigger threat to this top-down control: the smartphone.
Ah, yes. Digital Salafism.
Right. Because Morocco has built this massive, slow-moving institutional ship. They have the official councils, the sanctioned textbooks, the televised sermons.
But they're competing against a highly agile, decentralized ecosystem of short-form videos. The state can control the physical mosque, but it struggles to control the digital algorithm.
So a charismatic, radical preacher on TikTok or YouTube doesn't need a state-sanctioned degree. They just bypass the institutional hierarchy entirely.
Mohammed Abdelwahab Rafiki, an expert, cited in the text cautions that this creates a disorderly religious framing.
Because the state's theology is complex. It relies on nuance, historical context, philosophical balancing.
Whereas Salafist content online is often black and white, highly emotional, and easily digestible in a 60-second video, Morocco is finding it incredibly difficult to translate its sophisticated theological software into a format that competes in the digital arena.
It's fascinating. So we see how theology can be used as a shield, right? A stabilizing force designed to maintain borders and prevent internal radicalization.
Right.
But if we follow the logic of sacred statecraft, the same tools can be inverted. The software can be rewritten to bypass borders entirely.
Now we're moving from the shield to the sword.
Exactly. We need to look at what happens when a state uses theology to justify kinetic expansionist war. Which brings us to the Russian Federation and the ideological architecture behind the war in Ukraine.
Yeah. To understand the Russian model, we have to look at the concept of Ruski Mir, or the Russian world.
Right.
The St. Antony's College paper in our stack details how this ideology has completely fused the Kremlin with the Russian Orthodox Church, the ROC.
They have basically constructed a vision of a geopolitical space that transcends the modern legal borders of the Russian Federation.
They aren't just claiming a sphere of political influence, they are claiming a distinct civilizational and spiritual jurisdiction over Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and beyond.
And this isn't subtle at all. The rhetoric deployed by Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, explicitly frames the invasion of Ukraine not as a territorial dispute over NATO expansion or resources.
No, he calls it a literal metaphysical battle. Kirill's framing is deeply calculated. He has routinely contrasted the traditional values of the Russian world with the perceived moral decay of the liberal West.
Like in one of his most infamous sermons justifying the war, he specifically cited gay pride parades.
Right. He argued that these parades are a loyalty test imposed by the West, a symbol of ultimate sin. Therefore, in his theological framework, if Ukrainians align with the West, they accept this moral decay, and the land ceases to be holy.
It turns a war of aggression into a defensive moral crusade. You aren't invading a neighbor, you are physically resisting a spiritual contagion.
And the sources detail a staggering escalation of this theology. The Russian Orthodox Church preemptively promised the remission of sins to soldiers fighting and dying in Ukraine.
Wait, really? Just a blanket remission of sins?
Yes. They told young men that dying on the battlefield washes away their worldly sins.
That is wild. We are looking at 21st century statecraft, utilizing literally 11th century crusade theology.
It is, and this direct transactional militarization of faith triggered a massive theological backlash.
From who?
The Conference of European Churches, the CEC, they issued a fierce, formal denunciation of the Ruski Mir ideology, officially declaring it heretical.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, the CEC document meticulously dismantles the theological justification for the war, and they specifically target the myth of the katachon state, which is central to the Kremlin's narrative.
Okay, let's pause and define katachon for the listener, because understanding this concept really explains the absolute maximalism of Russian foreign policy. Where does this term even come from?
It originates from Christian eschatology, specifically from the Apostle Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians.
Okay.
Katachon translates from Greek as the restrainer, or that which withholds. In the biblical context, it refers to the force that holds back the manifestation of the Antichrist and the end of the world.
Right. So over the last 2 decades, the Russian Orthodox Church and Russian nationalist philosophers have aggressively adopted this concept. They have positioned the Russian state itself as the modern katachon.
Exactly. They are telling their population that Russia is the sole global force physically holding back the absolute evil of secular, liberal Western hegemony.
And if you genuinely believe your nation is the literal restrainer of the Antichrist, then any level of violence, any amount of civilian casualties is entirely justified. You are saving the world from the apocalypse.
But the CEC forcefully rejects this. They state unequivocally that for Christians, there is no such thing as a holy war.
Right.
They argue that assigning the role of the katachon to a secular nation-state is a profound theological distortion. It sacralizes political power and substitutes the core gospel message of love with hatred and imperial expansion.
But the thing is, the Russian state hasn't just kept this in sermons, right? They have physically built it into their infrastructure.
Oh, the architect.
Yes. The sources highlight the main cathedral of the armed forces, located outside Moscow. The architecture alone is a terrifying manifestation of sacred statecraft.
It's a massive, dark, highly militaristic structure.
And the steps and the metal floors of the cathedral are literally forged from the melted-down tracks of Nazi tanks captured during the Second World War.
Every time a worshiper walks into the church, they are stepping on the conquered weapons of an enemy.
Is the architectural fusion of military triumph, state power, and divine blessing.
And they embedded this fusion into the legal framework of the state, too. In 2020, the Russian constitution was amended to include a specific reference to God and to the defense of traditional family values.
And then the 2021 National Security Strategy formally lists the protection of these traditional spiritual and moral values as a core pillar of national security.
Equating moral conservatism with military defense.
I actually need to stop the timeline here.
Yeah.
Because the common assumption in the West is that Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, simply co-opted a weak church and forced them to bless his tanks.
Right, that the state tells the church what to do and the church obeys.
Exactly. But the St. Anthony's College paper completely inverts that assumption.
It's a vital paradigm shift. The paper argues that the Russian Orthodox Church was not a passive victim of state coercion. They were an active agent. In fact, they were the original architect of this anti-Western imperial policy starting all the way back in the early 1990s.
Okay, let's walk through that. Why was the church building this ideological engine in the 90s when the Russian state was actually trying to integrate with the West?
Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Russian state lost its political empire. But the Russian Orthodox Church faced an equally devastating crisis, the loss of its canonical territory.
Right, because as newly independent nations like Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine sought political sovereignty from Moscow, their local Orthodox churches also began seeking canonical independence from the Moscow Patriarchate.
The Moscow Patriarchate was watching its spiritual empire fracture right before its eyes. To halt this fracturing, throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the church began heavily promoting the concept of the Russian world.
They needed a theological argument to convince believers in Kiev and Minsk that they were spiritually bound to Moscow, regardless of where the new political borders were drawn.
Exactly. They positioned Moscow as the necessary guardian of a unique, unified civilization under threat from Western secularism and competing religious influences.
So fast forward to the late 2000s and 2010s. The Kremlin's foreign policy begins turning sharply anti-Western, driven by NATO expansion, the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, and Putin's desire to reassert Russian dominance.
Right. And the state looks around for an ideology to justify an aggressive, expansionist posture and realizes the church has spent 20 years building the exact vehicle they need.
It really is a symbiotic relationship.
Very much so. The church needed the coercive power of the state to enforce its canonical boundaries, suppress competing religions, and pass laws criminalizing dissent.
Like the laws against offending believers' feelings or the intense crackdowns on LGBTQ rights.
Exactly. In return, the state needed the church's moral authority to justify territorial conquest and to mobilize the populace for war. They converged on a shared imperial vision.
And they aren't just deploying this ideology domestically. The sources reveal how Russia projects this theological soft power globally, attempting to mobilize allies deep inside Western democracies.
Oh, yes. The ROC has actively engaged with right-wing conservative political actors and organizations in the United States and Europe, like the World Congress of Families.
Which is a highly deliberate strategy to fracture Western unity from within.
It is. The ROC identifies factions within the West who feel alienated by the secular, liberal policies of their own governments. By emphasizing a shared critique of multiculturalism, same-sex marriage, and secular democracy, Russia presents itself to these groups not as a foreign adversary, but as the last true defender of global Christian morality.
It is a surreal dynamic. A conservative voter in Europe or America might look at their own secular government with suspicion while viewing the Russian state as a moral ally.
The European Parliament actually issued a resolution condemning this exact tactic. They noted that Russia recruits Orthodox priests in places like Moldova to agitate congregations against European Union integration, entirely under the guise of protecting traditional values.
It proves that theology can cross borders much faster than tanks.
Yeah. By aligning with Western culture warriors, Russia complicates the domestic political consensus required for Western governments to maintain sanctions or military support against them.
Which seamlessly transitions us to our third key question.
Right.
We have looked at a North African monarchy and an authoritarian Eastern European state with a deeply entrenched national church.
Right.
It is very easy for a Western listener to observe this and think, well, that is how they operate. Our system is immune. But how does the new geopolitics of faith manifest in a constitutionally secular superpower?
We have to turn the lens on the United States.
Right. and analyze the discourse surrounding the 2026 conflict with Iran.
The Al Jazeera Center for Studies report highlights a profound structural contradiction in American foreign policy.
Because the United States is explicitly founded on the separation of church and state. The First Amendment prevents the establishment of a national religion, and the Constitution forbids any religious test for public office.
On paper, the U.S. is the ultimate secular actor on the global stage.
Yet in practice, its foreign policy discourse, particularly during times of crisis, is deeply saturated with sacred narratives.
Let's look at the specific scenario outlined in the sources, the 2026 U.S.-Israeli war on Iran.
Okay. If you read the official press briefings from the State Department or the Pentagon, the language is highly technical and secular. They talk about nuclear non-proliferation, protecting vital shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, countering state-sponsored terrorism, maintaining regional security architecture.
It sounds like the rational chess game we mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast.
Exactly. But beneath that sanitized official layer, a secondary, highly theological narrative emerges, often driven by the political leadership rather than the diplomatic corps.
The reports detail instances during the buildup to the conflict where U.S. military commanders were reported to have invoked the return of Jesus Christ as context for the regional instability.
Wow.
Yeah. You have defense official Pete Hegseth utilizing explicitly Christian crusader-adjacent rhetoric. You have President Trump hosting Oval Office prayer gatherings specifically focused on the impending conflict.
And one of the most alarming details cited was a report that U.S. troops were told the war on Iran was all part of God's divine plan, with the term Armageddon actively circulating in the political discourse.
It's heavy stuff.
We have to ask why. Why does a secular superpower with the most advanced military technology on the planet resort to apocalyptic religious narratives to justify a geopolitical conflict over uranium enrichment?
It really comes back to the concept of American civil religion, a term popularized by sociologist Robert Bellah.
Which means what exactly?
Well, while the U.S. lacks a formal state church, it possesses a robust, distinct civil religion. It's a set of sacred beliefs, symbols, and rituals related to the nation itself.
Oh, like the deeply ingrained idea that America has a providential role in human history.
Yes, that it is the city upon a hill tasked with spreading liberty.
The text draws a direct parallel to the Cold War, actually.
Right. When the U.S. faced off against the Soviet Union, the political establishment didn't just sell the conflict to the American public as a debate over the economic efficiencies of capitalism versus command economies.
No, they framed it as a cosmic moral struggle. It was the free world against godless communism. That era saw the addition of "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and "in God we trust" to the currency.
Religious language offers immense political utility during wartime. It simplifies complex, nuanced geopolitical realities into an easily digestible binary of good versus evil.
Because it is incredibly difficult to convince a democratic population to endure the massive economic costs, the supply chain disruptions, and the horrific human toll of war based on abstract theories of nuclear deterrence.
Exactly. It's much easier to secure their consent if you convince them they are participating in a divine mandate to vanquish absolute evil. It mobilizes the domestic base efficiently.
But the Al Jazeera report warns that this domestic mobilization creates a catastrophic vulnerability abroad.
It creates a diplomatic trap.
How so?
Because the fundamental rule of diplomacy is that you cannot negotiate with absolute evil.
Oh, wow. Right.
If the U.S. strictly frames the conflict with Iran as a strategic dispute over the percentage of uranium enrichment and ballistic missile testing, the diplomats have room to maneuver.
They can establish inspection regimes, offer sanctions relief, find a pragmatic middle ground.
But if the political leadership frames Iran as an agent of darkness in a divinely orchestrated end times scenario, how do you sign a treaty with the devil?
You can't. If it truly is Armageddon, compromise is morally treasonous. The only acceptable outcome is total, unconditional destruction of the adversary.
And this creates a terrifying escalation loop when it collides with an adversary that utilizes the exact same operating system.
Because Iran is a literal theocracy.
Exactly. They explicitly frame their geopolitical struggle against the U.S. and Israel in Islamic theological terms. They view themselves as the defenders of the faith against the great Satan.
So if both the U.S. and Iran are internally convinced that they are executing God's will, the conflict loses all its off-ramps.
It guarantees maximalist existential warfare rather than a limited strategic engagement.
I struggle with this part of the analysis, though.
What do you mean?
As an observer of politics, We know that politicians pander. If a secular leader uses religious rhetoric at a rally or in a press conference to drum up poll numbers, isn't that just cynical political theater?
You're wondering if they actually believe it.
Yeah. Do the policymakers actually believe it? Like, if a leader tells the troops they are fighting God's divine plan, at what point does the Pentagon actually start planning military operations based on the Book of Revelation?
Well, the danger of cynical instrumentalization is that words eventually shape reality. A politician might initially use apocalyptic rhetoric purely as a tool for domestic mobilization. But over time, the personnel within the government, the younger aides, the junior officers, the voters who eventually run for office, grow up internalizing that rhetoric as absolute truth.
The theater becomes the policy.
Exactly. Furthermore, even if the top leadership knows it's just a rhetorical device, it irrevocably damages the nation's geopolitical standing.
Because it's hypocritical.
Right. When the U.S. demands that other nations behave as rational secular actors, while simultaneously deploying crusader rhetoric at home, it shreds its own credibility. It validates the narratives of adversaries who claim the West is engaged in a religious war against Islam.
Which brings us to the broader demographic reality. The sources note that Islam is the world's fastest-growing faith tradition, precisely at a moment when multiple Muslim-majority states are at war or in proxy conflicts with the West.
It's a powder keg.
If the U.S. inadvertently slips into a Christian nationalist framing of its foreign policy, it sets the stage for a genuine clash of civilizations. It transforms localized political disputes into global sectarian conflicts.
Which is the exact scenario pragmatic diplomacy was designed to prevent. It abandons the neutral ground required for conflict resolution. If you view the world solely through a theological lens, every conflict becomes an existential threat to your spiritual identity.
That makes total sense. So we have explored how states project religious power to stabilize themselves, like Morocco, and how they frame their own wars, like Russia and the U.S.
Right.
But this leads us to our final core question, and perhaps the most complex dynamic in the entire stack. How do states categorize and respond to religious violence abroad?
We are looking at the nexus of policy, persecution, and advocacy in Nigeria.
Yes.
Nigeria serves as a tragic but perfect case study of how external framing can completely reshape a domestic conflict.
The core text we are analyzing revolves around a specific piece of U.S. legislation, right?
Yes, the Nigeria Religious Freedom and Accountability Act of 2026, designated as H.R. 7457. This bill was introduced by U.S. Representatives Chris Smith and Riley Moore.
And this legislation represents a massive exercise of congressional oversight driven by a highly specific narrative.
The bill mandates the U.S. Secretary of State to compile exhaustive, detailed reports on Nigeria's compliance with religious freedom. It demands the tracking of atrocities committed by extremist groups, specifically naming Boko Haram and Fulani terrorists.
But the language within the bill is very targeted. It focuses intensely on violence directed against Christians and non-radical Muslims, and it requires investigations into Nigeria's blasphemy laws.
Right. But the text provided by the Boston College Boise Center reveals the geopolitical earthquake that occurred around this legislation.
Yeah, the Boise Center details how a diverse coalition of Nigerian Christian advocacy groups and U.S. Republican lawmakers engaged in a sustained high-level lobbying campaign.
Their goal was to force the U.S. administration to view the ongoing, horrifying violence in Nigeria through a single defining lens as a Christian genocide.
And they succeeded in changing the narrative software of the U.S. government regarding Nigeria. This advocacy resulted in Nigeria being officially redesignated by the U.S. State Department as a country of particular concern, or a CPC.
Right.
Let's explain the mechanics of a CPC designation, because it isn't just a sternly worded letter. What does it actually do?
Being designated a country of particular concern is a major diplomatic mechanism under the U.S. International Religious Freedom Act.
Yeah.
It signals that a foreign government has engaged in or tolerated severe violations of religious freedom. Practically, it opens the door for the U.S. president to impose heavy economic sanctions, restrict foreign assistance, block military sales, and sever financial ties.
It basically takes a nation out of the category of partner and places them in the category of pariah.
Exactly. But the narrative shift achieved far more than economic sanctions.
Right. The Boise Center text details a profound kinetic outcome. The U.S. military ultimately executed Tomahawk missile strikes on Christmas Day against suspected militants in Nigeria.
This is the ultimate catastrophic manifestation of bottom-up sacred statecraft.
You have religious advocacy groups successfully forcing the hand of a global superpower to launch a military intervention in a sovereign African nation based on a theological framing.
Which forces us to address the central question: is the violence in Nigeria a foreign policy issue, a human rights issue, or
I
a
don't know.
religious issue? And who holds the power to decide?
The expert consensus in the sources is deeply fractured on this. The advocacy groups effectively monopolize the microphone.
Right. By framing the violence exclusively as a Christian genocide, they triggered immediate moral outrage.
It taps into that American civil religion we just discussed, the innate belief that America has a divine historical duty to protect the persecuted. Genocide is a word that demands action.
But regional experts, anthropologists, and critics argued that this framing dangerously flattens an incredibly complex web of intersecting crises.
Because the reality on the ground in Nigeria's Middle Belt involves massive historical land disputes.
Right. You have severe desertification and climate change in the north, pushing nomadic Fulani herdsmen southward into territories held by sedentary farming communities.
The cattle destroy the crops, the farmers retaliate against the herdsmen, and a cycle of brutal violence erupts over basic survival and land use.
Add to that an environment of extreme poverty, high unemployment, weak state governance, and organized criminal banditry where kidnapping for ransom is a lucrative industry.
And critically, the violence is not religiously exclusive. Groups like Boko Haram have slaughtered countless Muslims who do not adhere to their specific radical ideology.
Exactly. When U.S. politicians reduce this multi-layered socioeconomic and environmental collapse into a simplified story of Muslims killing Christians, they misdiagnose the disease.
And when you misdiagnose the disease, you prescribe the wrong medicine. By adopting the religious lens, the U.S. administration felt morally and politically compelled to utilize hard, power-launching missiles.
But bombing a nomadic herdsman camp doesn't reverse desertification?
No. And it carries a massive risk of blowback. If a Western majority Christian superpower launches missiles into Nigeria explicitly under the banner of protecting Christians, doesn't that just validate the propaganda of the extremists?
It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Groups like Boko Haram recruit by telling marginalized youth that the Christian West is engaged in a crusade to destroy Islam.
Wow.
When Tomahawk missiles fall from the sky to protect Christian communities, the extremists point to the creators and say, "We told you so."
It risks taking a localized conflict over scarce resources and internationalizing it into a global religious war.
It entrenches the sectarian divides, making the violence worse for the very people the advocates are trying to save.
Think about the immense power of a narrative label. If violence in the global south is categorized by diplomats in Washington or Brussels as a land use dispute or climate migration, it gets filed away in a bureaucratic folder.
Nobody launches a multi-billion-dollar military campaign over a grazing dispute.
Right. But if you take that exact same violence with the exact same victims and label it a religious genocide, it summons missiles from the sky. The label we apply to a tragedy dictates whether the world cares about it and how the world responds.
The label defines the machinery. A human rights issue summons aid workers and UN observers. A political issue summons diplomats. A religious genocide summons the military.
Applying a Western religiously polarized lens to a post-colonial African conflict is an exercise in profound geopolitical danger.
It truly is.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We have watched states rewrite the operating system of global power.
Yeah, from Morocco deploying female religious guides into living rooms to prevent radicalization.
To the Russian Orthodox Church fusing with the military, building cathedrals out of melted weapons to justify imperial conquest.
And we've seen secular American leaders utilize the language of Armageddon to mobilize the public for Middle Eastern conflicts.
And finally, how religious lobbying in Washington can summon airstrikes in Nigeria.
The inescapable conclusion from all these sources is that the 20th century secularization theory, the idea that as societies modernize, religion will quietly fade into the private sphere, was entirely wrong.
Religion is not retreating. It is aggressively reasserting itself as the primary grammar of global power.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought, something for you to explore as you continue to analyze this landscape.
Right, something to think about on your own.
If the lines between theology and geopolitics are now permanently blurred, what does that mean for the intelligence agencies and the State Departments of the future?
Well, the next generation of diplomats and CIA analysts need to be trained theologians, just as much as political scientists?
It almost becomes a baseline requirement. You cannot accurately assess the threat matrix of an adversary or successfully negotiate a peace treaty if you do not deeply understand their sacred texts, their eschatology, and their spiritual worldview.
If a diplomat attempts to resolve a religious conflict using the tools of secular resource management, they are playing a game without understanding the rules.
Exactly.
We started this deep dive talking about a chessboard. We thought we knew how the pieces moved, based on money, land, and rational interest. But when the knights and the pawns believe their movements are guided by the hand of God, the old strategies fail.
The board is floating, the rules are invisible, and the stakes are no longer just earthly territory, but the fate of the soul itself.
Navigating that reality will be the defining existential challenge of 21st century statecraft.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for trusting us to synthesize this material for you today. If you found value in this deep dive, please remember to follow the broadcast and leave a 5-star rating. It truly helps expand our reach so we can continue dissecting these complex topics for you.
And don't forget the Patreon link in the description for our Danish political briefings.
Yes, check that out. Until next time, look past the hardware and keep questioning the software.